I never expected that a simple invitation for coffee would change my life forever. At 64 years old, I thought I had experienced the biggest surprises life had to offer. Retirement was just around the corner, and most of my days consisted of repetition. Wake up, work, go home, repeat. I wasn't complaining. When my husband died 6 years ago, the routine became a form of comfort, a quiet buffer against the pain of absence. I worked as an office administrator in a small architectural firm. It wasn't glamorous, but it gave me structure, a reason to get dressed every morning. A place where I felt at least partially useful. My boss, Alan Preston, was the kind of man you respected from a distance. Reserved, thoughtful, in his late 50s, always immaculately dressed. He wasn't cold, but he rarely let anyone get close, and that suited me just fine. We kept things professional. Until the day he knocked softly on the edge of my desk and said, "Do you have a minute for coffee after work?" It wasn't the request itself that caught me off guard. It was the softness in his voice, almost hesitant, as if this invitation carried more weight than it should have. I hesitated for a second too long. Long enough for him to add, "Only if you're free, no pressure." I found myself nodding up before my thoughts could catch up. "Sure, Mr. Preston." He smiled, just a small lift of the corner of his mouth. "Alan," he corrected gently. That simple correction sent a ripple through me. I hadn't called him by his first name in the 10 years I'd worked there. But that night, after the office had emptied out, I walked beside him to the cafe across the street, like it was the most natural thing in the world. We didn't speak much on the way. The silence wasn't awkward, though. It felt deliberate, as if the words would come when they were ready. When we sat down in the corner booth, he removed his jacket, rested his hands on the table, and looked at me, not like a boss, but like a man who had been carrying something heavy. "I've been meaning to do this for a while," he said, finally breaking the silence. "Not to talk about work, not about reports or meetings." I nodded slowly, unsure of where he was going. "It's about you." Those words, so direct, felt like a weight against my chest. My fingers curled slightly around my coffee cup. "I've noticed something. For a long time now." He paused, and in that pause, I felt the years of silence between us fill with unspoken observations. My heart started to race, not out of fear, but something else. A quiet dread, a strange hope. "I see how you move through the office," he said. "You're reliable, kind. Everyone leans on you. But I get the sense no one sees how tired you are." I looked away. That struck closer to the truth than I was prepared for. I felt suddenly naked in front of him, as though all the quiet sadness I'd carried had become visible. But I said nothing. "I don't want to overstep," he added, "but you matter, Martha. You do more than you realize. And I guess I just wanted to say that." I could barely breathe, not because of what he said, but because I hadn't realized how deeply I needed to hear it. And that was only the beginning. The following morning, I arrived at the office earlier than usual. I told myself it was just to catch up on paperwork, but the truth was harder to admit. I couldn't stop thinking about what Alan had said. It replayed in my head like a soft echo. "You matter, Martha." Words so simple, yet they hit like a wave against a fragile shore. No one had spoken to me like that in years, not with that kind of sincerity. I moved through the office in my usual way, nodding to coworkers, refilling the paper trays, organizing the front desk. But the edges of everything felt a little softer, like someone had dimmed the harshness of the fluorescent lights just for me. Alan greeted me with a quiet good morning and a subtle glance, acknowledging but not intrusive. I appreciated that more than I could say. Over the next few days, nothing dramatic happened, and yet everything had changed. He didn't treat me differently, not in a way others would notice, but I noticed. He stopped by my desk more often, asked how I was sleeping, what I was reading lately. Tiny things, human things, and I surprised myself by answering honestly. I told him about my difficulty falling asleep, about the dusty box of old poetry books I had reopened last weekend, about the small ache in my hip that made gardening harder. Each time he listened, really listened, not out of obligation, but curiosity, maybe even care. There were no grand gestures, no dramatic confessions, just small moments that began stitching me back together. One evening, as I was about to leave, Alan appeared beside the elevator. "Heading out?" he asked. I nodded. "Yes. Thought I'd catch the early bus." He hesitated for a moment, then said, "Would you mind if I walked you to the stop?" I almost declined out of habit, out of the instinct to avoid imposing. But something in his expression stopped me. He wasn't asking for company. He was offering it. "Sure," I said, and we stepped out into the golden hue of late afternoon. The walk was short but quiet. Not silent, but thoughtful. He asked about my weekend plans, and I told him I'd likely spend it alone. Maybe at the park, if my hip behaved. Then I turned the question back on him. He chuckled softly. "I don't really make plans anymore. I just keep moving, one day at a time." That sentence sat between us like a familiar ache. I understood it too well. When we reached the stop, the bus hadn't arrived yet. We stood together, facing the street. He didn't say anything right away. But then he added quietly, "You remind me of someone I lost. Not in how you look or speak, but in how you endure, gracefully, even when it's hard." I didn't respond. I couldn't. My throat tightened, but I didn't cry. Instead, I looked at him, really looked, and saw in his expression the reflection of a grief he didn't talk about, a solitude that mirrored my own. The bus pulled up, and I stepped on. As I turned to wave goodbye, he met my eyes with a look that said more than either of us could put into words. That night, I sat with a cup of tea and stared at the unopened poetry book on my lap. I wasn't ready to read, but I wasn't numb anymore either. And that, for the first time in a long time, felt like something real beginning. The following week settled into a quiet rhythm. Work moved along as usual. Phone calls, scheduling, invoices, but I felt different moving through it. Lighter somehow. I still carried my aches, both the physical and invisible ones. But there was something else now. A thread of warmth, a softness that seemed to come from the awareness that someone had noticed, really noticed. Alan didn't bring up our walk to the bus stop. He didn't need to. It lingered between us in the way he asked if I'd eaten lunch, in the way he paused slightly when saying good morning, like he was checking to see how I really was. I'd grown used to being invisible. Now, I wasn't sure what to do with being seen. One Thursday afternoon, just as the office had begun to empty for the day, I heard a light knock on my office door. I looked up to see Alan standing there, one hand still on the frame. "I was going to grab a tea. Would you like to come?" he asked, his tone casual. But something behind his eyes told me the question meant more. I hesitated only a moment before closing my laptop. "Sure." We walked in silence again, not because we had nothing to say, but because the silence itself had become part of the conversation. We ended up at a small, nearly empty cafe around the corner, a place with worn leather seats and soft lighting. It reminded me of places I used to frequent with my husband, back when life was more social, less quiet. Alan ordered chamomile for both of us without asking. "You mentioned once it helps your joints." I remembered. I felt the warmth bloom in my chest. I couldn't recall the last time someone remembered something about me that wasn't work-related. We sat by the window. Outside, people moved with purpose, rushing home, checking phones, hailing cabs. But we were still, present. "I've been thinking," he said, breaking the quiet, "about the things we never say out loud." I looked at him carefully. His gaze was steady, but soft. "You spend your whole life believing you have time to say what matters, time to rest, time to forgive. But it's all thinner than we think. He wasn't looking for a response. He was speaking a truth into the space between us. I lost my sister 2 years ago, he continued, after a pause. Cancer. She was younger than me, vibrant, the kind of woman who made a room feel brighter. I swallowed, quietly. She worked too hard, ignored the signs, said she'd rest later. Later never came. I reached for my tea, unsure how to respond. But he didn't need comfort. He needed honesty. I look at you, he said suddenly, and I see someone who gives and gives. But I wonder, do you let yourself receive? His words cut deeper than I expected. I stared into my cup, the steam blurring my reflection. I don't know, I admitted. It's been a long time since I've thought about that. Alan leaned back, studying me, not critically, but thoughtfully. You deserve more than just surviving the day, Martha. There it was again, that feeling of being seen, stripped of all the roles I'd carried for years. Widow, worker, caretaker. And underneath it all, just a woman, still here, still wanting something more. We didn't linger much after that. He paid the bill before I could protest and walked me back toward the office, the city glowing in the early evening light. When we reached the corner where we usually parted, he stopped. I know it's late, he said gently, but if you ever want to talk, really talk, I'm here. I nodded slowly. Thank you, Alan. He smiled, just enough to leave warmth behind, and turned to go. I watched him disappear into the crowd, feeling something inside me shift again. I wasn't sure what it meant or where it was leading, but I knew one thing with certainty. I had started to wake up. The days moved on, slow and steady. Spring unfolded gently outside the windows, and I began to notice things I hadn't in years. The new growth on the trees, the way the afternoon light hit the corner of my desk, the scent of rain in the air before it arrived. It was as though my senses had sharpened, or maybe I'd just stopped numbing them. Alan and I spoke often now, never about anything urgent. Sometimes it was about books, sometimes memories, sometimes nothing at all. There was a rhythm to it, unspoken but familiar, like we were both learning how to exist in the quiet spaces without needing to fill them. One afternoon, as I organized the supply closet, I overheard 2 younger staff members talking. "Do you think something's going on with Mr. Preston and Martha?" one whispered. The other laughed. "She's old enough to be his, well, I don't know, but still, they've been getting close." I froze, one hand resting on a stack of binders. I wasn't embarrassed. I wasn't even angry, but I was startled. Not by the gossip, but by the realization that others had noticed too. That evening, I stayed late to finish up reports. Alan came by, holding 2 cups of tea. He handed me one without a word, then sat down across from me. "I heard what they said," I admitted. He nodded. So did I. We sat in silence for a moment. Then he said, "Let them talk. They don't understand what it means to truly see another person, or to be seen." I looked at him closely. He wasn't uncomfortable. He wasn't backing away. He was simply there. "What is this to you?" I asked, the words spilling out before I could filter them. "Whatever's happening between us, what do you call it?" He didn't hesitate. "Respect," he said softly. "Connection. A friendship that matters. I don't need to define it beyond that." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I hadn't wanted a label. I just needed to know I wasn't alone in feeling it. Later that night, I took a long bath, the kind I hadn't taken in years. I lit a candle, put on soft music. Not for anyone else, for me. And as I soaked, I thought about how far I'd come. How I was no longer just existing, but noticing, choosing. And I wondered, how many women my age stop believing they can start over? How many of us convince ourselves that the best parts are behind us? That connection, discovery, even gentle affection belong only to the young? But what Alan and I shared wasn't about age. It wasn't about romance either, not exactly. It was about depth. It was about two people who had carried their private griefs long enough to understand the value of quiet presence. The next day, I brought in a small potted plant for the break room, lavender, something that smelled like calm. I didn't say anything about it, but Alan noticed right away. "You're making this place softer," he said with a smile. "Maybe I'm just softening myself," I replied. He didn't respond. He didn't need to. That moment held all the truth we needed. That Friday, something unexpected happened. Just after lunch, Alan asked if I had a moment. I followed him to his office, expecting a quick update or small task. But instead of sitting at his desk, he stood near the window, hands clasped behind his back. The light behind him made his outline look softer, almost uncertain. "I've been offered an early transition package," he said after a long pause. "They want to bring in new leadership, fresh perspective, younger energy. I haven't accepted yet, but I'm thinking about it." I stared at him, not quite understanding what I felt. The thought of him not being here, it unsettled me more than I expected. This place, our quiet rhythm, the familiar way he said good morning, it had become part of my landscape. "Is that what you want?" I asked. He finally turned to face me. "I don't know. Maybe. It's made me think about what I'd do with more time." He paused, then added, "Made me think about what matters. And who." His words weren't pointed. He wasn't trying to sway me into anything. But they settled deep, like a pebble dropped into still water, rippling outward. "I suppose we all eventually come to that crossroad," I said quietly, "where time becomes something we feel, not just something we spend." He nodded, and I could see it in his face. He was tired. Not defeated, but ready for something else. We didn't speak of it again that day, but the air between us was different, stretched thin with the possibility of change. That weekend, I walked the longer path through the park, the one that wound near the creek and through the tall trees. It had been years since I'd taken that route. Everything felt alive, raw and honest. The birdsong, the smell of damp bark, the ache in my knees, it all felt like it belonged. When I returned home, I sat by the window and watched the sky change colors. I didn't feel fear, not exactly. But I felt the pull of something unknown, something unformed. I wasn't used to that feeling. Not anymore. For years, I had clung to the predictable, the safe. But now, safety didn't feel the same as it used to. It felt more like a hiding place I'd outgrown. On Monday, Alan looked different, lighter. He came by my desk near the end of the day and placed a small envelope in front of me. I gave my answer. He said, "I'm stepping away. 3 weeks from now." I opened the envelope later, in private. Inside was a handwritten note. "Thank you for reminding me that meaning doesn't have to come in loud declarations. Sometimes it's found in quiet courage. Yours has been a gift I didn't expect." Tears welled in my eyes before I even realized they had. Not from sadness, but from being acknowledged in a way that reached straight to the core. I tucked the note into my journal, between 2 pages I hadn't yet written on. And then I picked up my pen. Because something was ending. But something else, something honest and alive, was beginning. The last 3 weeks passed slowly and all at once. Alan continued his days as if nothing had changed, but I could feel it in the way he lingered a little longer near my desk, in the way our conversations stretched just past the usual boundaries. We didn't talk much about what was next, for him or for me. Maybe because neither of us fully knew. Maybe because we didn't want to say anything that might turn a quiet connection into something too heavy. On his final day, the office gathered for a small send-off. There were cards, polite speeches, even cake. Alan thanked everyone, said the things people expect to hear. But when he turned to me, his gaze softened. "I'll be in touch," he said, and it wasn't a question. It was a promise. When the others had gone back to their desks, I walked him to the elevator. He stood there, briefcase in hand, looking at me like he had more to say, but didn't want to place that weight on me. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded slip of paper. "I've started going to the gardens more," he said. "There's a bench under the willow, you might remember. I usually sit there on Sundays. Just thought I'd mention it." I smiled, holding back the tightness in my chest. "Thank you for the tea," I said softly. He smiled. "Thank you for everything else." The elevator doors opened, and he stepped inside. As they closed, our eyes met one last time. That night, the house felt quieter than usual. I made myself tea, sat in the kitchen, and opened the folded paper. The next chapter isn't always clear. But sometimes, the person who helped you turn the page is the one you carry with you, no matter what story comes next. A few weeks passed. I settled back into the rhythms of the office, though something in me had shifted for good. I no longer moved through the day unseen, unnoticed. Not by others, but by myself. I started saying yes more, to invitations, to long walks, to small indulgences. I started journaling regularly again, filling page after page with thoughts, memories, questions I no longer feared asking. And on a Sunday morning, as the sun filtered through soft clouds, I put on my sweater, packed my notebook, and went to the botanical gardens. The willow tree stood just where I remembered. Alan wasn't there that day. I hadn't expected him to be. But I sat anyway, letting the breeze move through me, letting the silence speak. I wasn't waiting for him. I was simply being. I looked around, not just with my eyes, but with something deeper. And what I saw wasn't just flowers and trees, but a life that had cracked open gently, revealing a tender, unexplored part of me. Maybe we would meet again. Maybe we wouldn't. But I had found something. Not love, perhaps, but something just as rare. The courage to begin again. And that, in the quietest way, had changed everything. If you enjoyed this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and click on the bell, and share your impressions of listening to this story in the comments. Thank you for watching.